how realistic is it for an average guy that makes, maybe you're doing well and you're making $70,000 a year or something at your job, and you've got a wife and a kid or something like that. Like, how realistic is it anymore for a normal guy, to buy a chunk of land to deer hunt on?
It's definitely harder. It's definitely harder than what it was 20 years ago, and it'll definitely be harder 20 more years in the future. So I'd say right now is probably a great time. But for anyone that's in that position, I think it's ultra realistic. I think you're going to have to make sacrifices in some form or fashion in your life. I think you probably aren't going to need 2 car payments in your household, or better yet, have 0 car payments in your household. I think that, um, this was something that I shared on the podcast a couple weeks ago, but $20 a day. So lunch money, right? $20 a day. If you can save that a day, that's $10,000 that you just found. And so it's just those little sacrifices in order to save up on a down payment. Because I think that's probably the biggest hurdle for most people is saving up a down payment. I think you can, if you can find a second source of income, cut some costs, save some additional money, and just create some form of margin in your life. Because it's not easy. Because if it was easy, everyone would own land. And so
Right.
I pulled a kind of nerdy. I pulled out there's like through the census on a website. I was able to filter through my county, and I wanted to see how many people in my county own over 40 acres. 3%. 3% of people that live in this county own over 40 acres. So 40 acres to some people is a lot of land. But even to get to that point, you are, 3 out of 100 in order to do that. But I think it is attainable for everyone to do it. And that's the one interesting thing, or one of the interesting things with the land podcast is a lot of these guys that let's say a guy that owns 2,000 acres, he probably started with a 40, or
Yeah.
another guy that started with a 10 and then went to a 20 and then went to a 40. And to me, it's just you have to get started. You have to save up the money. Um, to put a little self pressure, like if this is something you want to do, I'd put a 2-year timeline. 2 years, I'm going to save up as much as money as possible, and then I'm going to try to go find a piece of ground to buy. And because I think if you wait, it just doesn't happen. It's the first step's the hardest, and saving up some money and getting. I mean, we can dive in all the details of what to do before you start shopping for land, but it's 100% attainable. It's just making sacrifices and making it a priority. I truly feel that. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had school teachers on here on the land podcast that bought a piece of ground. I mean, so they're public servants in reality. Like they don't make a bunch of money, but
No.
he was able to save up some money and buy a piece of ground. And I think it's possible. It's the original American dream, but it is attainable.
Yeah. Yeah. It does feel like it. Like, and I think maybe uh, as a consumer of land, like not me, I don't. I got like 6 acres here, but um, you often hear like around the watering hole, like, oh, Farmer John bought the 500 acre piece for a couple $1 million or whatever it is, and it
Mhm.
just, you hear those numbers and it just like, it's almost overwhelming. Like, is there for a deer hunter, is there like a specific type of land you would look for, or so you're not competing with a farmer
Yeah.
or someone like that?
No, that's a great question. I think there's a couple different type. I mean, some people just like to hunt timber. So I mean, obviously timber typically isn't going to crank out a bunch of annual returns. So maybe you're looking at something with a little less a little I think the perfect first farm in my mind is, let's say it's 40 acres and it's 15 acres tillable. It has crop history. If you want to cash rent it, you can cash rent it. If you want to just put it in the food plots, you can put it in food plots. Or if you want to own it for a year and then enroll it into CRP and get some form of income, because farmers aren't going to compete on chopped up tillable. They got big equipment now, and
They
some
want a
some
100 acre field.
exactly, yeah. And the thing of it too is it's funny where I'm at here in Illinois. There's some really good dirt, and what someone in western Nebraska would die for to farm, you
Yeah.
couldn't get a farmer to farm here. And so you have to put that back into perspective, because they're like, oh, that dirt's terrible. And it's like, so what's it do? 50 bushel beans? And they're like, yeah, well, I can do 65 or 70 on this piece and it costs twice as much. And so I think that's kind of a frame of reference you have to get into. And I think something that has a little bit of income is a great thing. Or and it also boils down to your goals. Like maybe you want a 40 that's all timber and you can build a little cabin and it's 4 hours away from your house. So I mean, there's so many different things, but the biggest thing is I think a lot of people get paralyzed on their first farm. It has to be perfect. It has to have this, and then they never buy anything. Like, just buy an okay farm. And at that point, you're going to learn what you really want and what you really don't want. And I think it's the same. This is the same parallel that I think a lot of people can relate to. Is you hear the term starter home. Like maybe it's a 3 bedroom, 1 bath, or 2 bedroom, 2 bath, or whatever it is. It's a place to get started. And then you live there, you pay down the mortgage, you maybe make some improvements, and then your family grows. And then you sell it, you take that equity and go into a house that is quote unquote your forever home or the next one. And I think farms are kind of similar. Like we all dream of the square 640, but you're not going to buy your square 640 as your first farm, and you're not going to buy a 5,000 square foot house as your first house too. So it's kind of the same parallel.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Um, because I'm probably guilty of that. I never think about like, whenever I envision me buying a farm, it's like this perfect, like, Bill Winke's
Right.
dream farm type thing. It's like, wait a minute. Bill's probably owned dozens of pieces of property, to get to where it is or
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, I mean, he was part of we interviewed him 21, I think it was, and we got his full story, which is on the Exodus YouTube channel and also on the Land podcast too. But he started with $12,000 to be a member of a big group, and that's how he got in there. And then he worked on it, and then he sold his shares, and then went and bought a piece of ground. So it's like this is the only concrete way to get started, and it's to simply start. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing. There's a lot of people I've met that have a very relatable job or relatable income, and I think that's something we all get paralyzed. Is we're in chapter one, right? Like if you haven't bought a piece of ground yet, you're in chapter one, and you're comparing yourself to guys that have been doing it for 20 years, 25 years, and I think that it can be paralyzing. Like, man, I'll never get there, but you just have to get started. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like anything.
How um how small is too small, do you think, to like invest in? Like when's is there like a threshold where it's like, okay, you got to have this much land for it to be a good investment?
Man, I hate to be the it depends guy on
Yeah.
podcasts because I hate when people do that to me. But I would say if I would say it's very dependent on your goals. But I mean, I think a 20 is a good place to start. But if you
Okay.
had 10 acres that butted up to a landfill, for example, then I'd say 10 acres is plenty to get you started and a place to hunt. And so I think 20 is a great place to start. And I think that 20 probably isn't going to be your last piece, but it's going to be your first piece, and you're going to learn a lot. And you just have to not dip your toe in it. You have to, make a plunge. But I think there's a lot of resources to get sharp before you're not going into it blindly anymore, I think, because there's so much good
Yeah.
information out there.
All right, let's start from the beginning. Like you mentioned earlier, what to do if you're wanting to buy a piece. Like, what's their first steps? Like, what does a guy like me, if I want to go buy a 40, where would you
Yeah.
start?
I would say number one, save up your down payment. That's just to figure out a good savings plan, and maybe a good way to practice to see if you can afford it. Maybe you think you want to spend, let's say, $1,000 a month on a payment, and so maybe you make that your forced savings $1,500 a month until you get to the down payment. So you kind of have a forced, like, there's not going to be a bunch of life adjustment because you've already been doing that for, let's say, a year or two. I think that's a good piece. And then the other thing is finding a good lender. There's when I was fresh out of college, this is kind of a crazy story. I went to go get a truck. I was dumb. I wasn't going to go buy a truck. I needed a loan to buy it. And
Did the same
and
thing.
yeah, and this bank, my local bank, would not lend to me because I didn't have any job history and everything else. And I'm like, gosh, dang it. And they said I was good, right? And I'm so like, I went and bought the truck. Truck sitting at my house, and they're like, yeah, we can't do it. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, all right, this is kind of embarrassing. So then I called another bank. They're like, they gave you a hard time. And I'm like, yeah. How much are you putting down? This much? They're like, oh, you're good. I was like, you don't like, there's nothing else. They're like, no, you're good to go. Just come on in, pick up a check, and buy the truck. And that story right there illustrates call multiple banks because different banks are going to lend you different things. There's different terms. There's a really good lender here in Illinois that I do a lot of business with, and they're extremely great to work with. Their rates are very competitive. So, I mean, just because you Google, what is a land loan interest rate, there's going to be variance if you call multiple lenders. And when you're looking at buying something, if you can shave off 0.2% or 0.3%, that's a big difference on the monthly payment. And so I think that's really important, is to shop for a lender, find someone that you can talk to, someone that's going to teach you the process too. Like, hey, like that's what these people do every single day, right? And so they're going to tell you some things to look for, and ultimately just be someone in your corner. So I think the save a down payment, find a good lender, and the other one's find a good agent too. So a buyer's agent, how it's structured, if it's listed, the seller pays for the commission. So you can have a buyer's agent, it's not going to cost you anything. And so you want someone that has done a lot of transactions and can be in your corner and can look at all these different things and ultimately provide a service that you don't have to pay for. So I think that's another really important thing. Just call some agents, find one you jive with well, explain kind of what you're looking for, and stay in their corner too, and say, hey, Do you have anything coming down the pipeline? Hey, this is what I'm looking for. Hey, what do you think of this piece? I found it online. I think that's for someone just getting started out. That's a really good piece of advice.
What do you think about all these like? I mean, there is so many of them. These like, I don't know what you properly would call them, like these deer hunting real estate agents. Um, like, is that the only way to go as a deer hunter now, or is that kind of a market that's is it causing the deer properties to be elevated because they're labeled that way?
Yeah, I don't. That's a good question. I think that the market will dictate what something is worth. So I mean, imagine like just say a premier farm, right? And you have someone that doesn't know all these intrinsic values of this unique piece, and then you do have a guy that does understand that. I could see how that would, force a higher price. Um, but I think there's a lot of people too that you just got to find someone that has the heart of a teacher and
Yeah,
knows just enough for like on the can bounce ideas around from a deer hunting perspective is probably a good place to be than the local real estate agent that doesn't really know much about recreational ground. And I mean honestly too, even like there's some really good tillable agents that understand tillable and farmland very well and they don't understand recreational well, and then there's the inverse of that too. So just whatever you're looking for, find a true expert in that field, someone that has some deals under their belt and someone that's willing to take the time to teach you too. I think is just ultra important, but it is a weird space. I remember like some of the guys that we talked to, the land podcast that was buying ground in the 90s, and then it was what we see, it was in its infancy of what we see today. Like there's so many specialized agents and
oh
specialized
man.
brokerages. It's crazy. And there's more every day, it feels like.
Oh, you just like drive down the road in some rural county somewhere, and like all the billboards are like, I don't know, hunting land, real estate, and I
Yeah.
don't just all kind of like, where are all these are? There's like a million of these companies. I used to just be like, whitetail properties. That was the only one,
Yeah. 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 And now there's so many localized and regionalized brokerages, but um, I don't know. I often wonder, like, is it good for the space or is it bad for the space? Or, and I also think it's like a current that it's whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen. Like life will
Yeah,
move on without your
yeah.
opinion.
You're probably right. I mean, I think when people are spending that much money on something, they're not gonna, they're gonna have their homework done usually, and
Mhm.
gonna pay for what it's worth, not necessarily. As a seller, even you're gonna want to have whatever label
Best
you want to put on your
representation.
land. Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
right. So you're not gonna do something stupid and undervalue your land. Hope you enjoyed that clip. The unedited full podcast is right here. And before you leave, hit the subscribe button for me.